Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you've joined me. On last week's podcast, we discussed the necessity of Joseph in times of spiritual declension. Jacob's sons no longer answered to God's full thought for them, but he couldn't leave them in that state, for their destiny was to grow into a nation that would be a light to the Gentiles. He had to call them back to their divine purpose. His means of doing so was the object of their hatred. In Egypt, Jacob learned that he had to release the smallness of his thinking about the dreams he had received so he could serve God's greater heavenly purpose. The dreams weren't about him at all, but about his brothers. He allowed God to change his worldview, and he rescued his brothers alive. So if you would like to listen to last week's podcast, I'll put a link below in the description. On today's podcast, I'm examining the generation that came out of Egypt. Exodus 6:9 tells us all we need to know about this generation's worldview. They were a people with broken spirits. The cruel slavery they endured for centuries had conquered them. And when they left home to go to work, they knew that this could possibly be the day they died, because the Egyptians didn't care if they lived or died. This constant fear of death had produced in them little hope, no expectations, and very few dreams. Then Moses appeared with the good news that God had come down to deliver them from Egypt. And for one day, the people allowed themselves to have hope. But it didn't last, because Pharaoh received Moses' demand that the people be allowed to go into the wilderness to worship the Lord with laughter and derision. He found it ludicrous that these enslaved and broken people had a God. "Who is this Lord that I should obey his voice?" Pharaoh asked. He would soon find out. In the meantime, he instructed his taskmasters that they were no longer to gather straw to make bricks. If Israel had time to go on a jaunt into the wilderness, they had time to gather their own straw. But Pharaoh told his men that the tally of the bricks must remain the same. Well, Israel couldn't gather straw and still meet the daily quota. It was impossible. Their taskmasters beat them and blamed them for failing to do the impossible. They even killed some of their foremen. The people blamed Moses for bringing this disaster upon them with his talk of God and deliverance. The experiences of the last few days only reinforced their worldview. Life was hard and death was easy. Moses turned to the Lord and complained that his coming had only increased the people's burden. God told him not to worry. By the time he was through with Egypt, Pharaoh would kick the people out. God's word came true. In a night, they were free. Moses was summoned to the palace. Pharaoh told him to take the people, their flocks, their herds, their God, and get out of Egypt. The people left rejoicing and praising the Lord, who had truly come down to deliver them. Waiting for them was a land that would be their very own. Egypt was behind them. A new day was dawning. Once more, their way of thinking only lasted until the first sign of trouble. They accused Moses and the Lord of wanting to kill them. If there was no food, God was starving them. If there was no water, God wanted them to die of thirst. God drew the Egyptians out after them, and when they saw Pharaoh and his army in their chariots, they knew that today was the day that they would die, like they always knew they would. The children of Israel saw every day on the journey as a catastrophe waiting to happen. Nothing changed from their days in Egypt. Every morning brought the day they could die. They had zero faith in the God who had delivered them from Egypt. If the Egyptians hadn't kicked them out, they would have been happy and content to live as they had before. At least they knew how to navigate Egypt and their many gods. This God they were following was a complete mystery, and they weren't eager to solve that mystery either. They murmured and complained every step of the way. This God required faith, and there wasn't any room in their worldview for faith. He had led them into a wilderness where a scorpion couldn't survive, much less all of them. So why were they here? What did he want? They viewed him through the lenses of unbelief and death. They simply refused to believe anything Moses told them. For all the prestige Moses would have in generations to come, during his lifetime, Moses was disregarded and ignored. The problem the people faced was that there were two voices demanding to be heard and obeyed. The Lord promised fullness and blessing if they would believe him. Their worldview spoke in the language of warnings, discouragements, and death. Only one of those voices could be heeded. Only one of those voices could be obeyed. Unfortunately, the people listened to their worldview. They reached Mount Sinai on the Arabian Peninsula. They'd only been there a short time when they awoke to the sound of thunder. They rushed out of their tents to see the mountain enveloped in a thick cloud with flashes of lightning. Loud trumpet blasts echoed over the land. The people trembled in fear. Only Moses could approach the mountain. The people had been forbidden to approach under the penalty of death. No penalty needed to be given. The last thing the people wanted to do was approach the mountain. They sent the elders to speak to Moses. Whatever God told Moses to do, they would do. But they didn't want God to speak to them anymore. They were terrified of him. He wasn't like the Egyptian gods. Those gods were demanding and capricious, but they could also be placated and bribed with offerings. Egypt had gods to answer every need of life. Most of the time, they ignored your requests, but every once in a while, they answered your prayers. And Egypt's gods never appeared in such a terrifying manner as the God upon the mountain had chosen to appear. They were represented by the most benign and familiar things of nature. They rarely spoke except through the cycles of nature or through their priest. Never did their voice sound like loud trumpet blasts that shattered their peace and eardrums. 40 days ago, Moses had disappeared into the cloud at the top of the mountain, and that's the last they had heard from him. What if he were dead? What would become of them? They needed to appoint themselves a new leader and a new God, a God that they could understand and approach. They chose Aaron as their leader and Hap, the God of courage, strength, and kingship, as their God. Hap had even conquered death. He would be the one who would lead them into the land. Aaron commanded the people to give him all the gold they had, and he would fashion a god for them. And when he finished sculpting the image of Hap, he presented it to them. The people were overjoyed. Now they had a God they recognized and trusted. They rose early the next day and brought sacrifices to their splendid new God. Just as the celebration reached its zenith, Moses appeared with 2 stone tablets in his hands. He raised them high over his head and dashed them to the ground. Then he plowed through the dancing people. He dragged Hap from his altar and had him broken up and ground into fine dust. He took the dust, put it in the water the Lord had provided, and made Israel drink. Next, he turned his anger on Aaron, who he had left in charge of the camp. "What were you thinking to allow the people to sin so greatly?" he asked his brother. Aaron's response wasn't the best. He blamed the people for insisting. He blamed Moses for disappearing. But he saved the best for last. He relieved himself of all responsibility for the idol. He explained that all he did was throw the gold into the fire. The calf appeared all on its own. Moses retreated to the tent of meeting to plead for the people. The Lord promised that they would still inherit the land, but since they were a compromised and sinful people, he would no longer be able to go up with them. He would send his angel before them. The people heard the news, and suddenly they were sorry. They had brought this calamity upon themselves. There was nothing they could do to atone for their sin. It was up to Moses now. Every morning they stood outside their tents and watched as the pillar of cloud descended upon the tent of meeting. And when it did, they fell on their faces and worshipped. Moses prevailed. He climbed the mountain, and when he returned, he had new stone tablets that God had written on, laws the people could follow. The covenant was renewed. A framework for daily living was provided. A year after arriving at Sinai, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle. Before they left for the promised land, the Lord explained to Moses how he would empty the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and all the other ites that inhabited Canaan. He would send a terror before the people to confuse the inhabitants and release swarms of wasps to drive them out. But he wouldn't empty the land all at once, but bit by bit, as the people were able to occupy the towns and cities. He didn't want the land to become desolate and have the wild beasts multiplied against them. Moses sent 12 men to spy out the land and bring back their reports. The spies saw a land as bountiful as the Lord had promised. They had nothing but good things to say about it until they came upon the giants. One terrified look and their whole world came crashing down around them. The giants were a game changer. And up until that moment, the land had been something to be valued and desired. Now it was something that would have to be warred, in their minds, against an invincible army. They were bricklayers, not warriors. Once provoked, the giants would wreak havoc until all Israel became their prey. When the spies told the people about the giants, they used this revealing phrase: "We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Numbers 13:33. They projected what they thought about themselves onto the giants. The giants will devour us. We know it, and the giants know it. The giants exposed their worldview. which had never really changed, but had just laid dormant during their time at Sinai. Now everything they had feared had come upon them. They had always expected to die, and that day had finally come. The people had spent an entire lifetime feasting on the wrong things and filling their minds with wrong thoughts. Their worldview justified their fear and their determination not to follow this God anymore. No one mentioned the fact that the giants wouldn't be immune to wasps. When the swarms attacked their cities, they would be driven out just like the rest of the inhabitants. But right now, fear was greater than reason. Caleb tried to intervene, but no one listened. Their worldview united the people into a mass hysteria. They had been sold a false bill of goods. Their worldview wouldn't allow them to go forward. It would only allow them to retreat in the hope of finding peace and safety. And just like that, Egypt wasn't a place of hard labor and easy death. It was now a place of plenty where they knew nothing but security. In their terror, the people lost all sense of reality. In Egypt, we had an abundance of food, they told each other, an abundance of choice. Not like this wilderness where we have nothing to eat but this worthless bread, manna, that makes us want to vomit. They knew what Egypt demanded. They knew how to navigate Egypt, and there was great security in knowing that. They didn't know the Lord at all, and they collectively decided that they would no longer live in terror of him. The giants became a bridge too far. They refused to cross it, and no one, not even this fearsome God, could make them. Israel's unbelief and lack of trust in God were two of the major contributors of Israel's failure in the wilderness. But there was another contributing factor. That factor was the land itself. And throughout their long history, they had heard stories of how God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a land of inheritance. And in the cool of the evenings, they spoke of how wonderful it would be to live in a land of their own, a little piece of real estate where they could settle down in safety and raise their children in peace. The land's value was only in what it meant to them. It served no other purpose. And when they saw the giants, the land lost all its worth. They were willing to go up and inhabit the land as long as it didn't cost them anything. Their worldview could be distilled in a single sentence: survival at any cost. They wouldn't risk their lives in order to trust the Lord because he hadn't done anything of note to earn their trust. Never once did they look at the land from the divine perspective. Never once did they ask the Lord why he had promised Abraham a land. Nor did they ask why God had come down to deliver them from Egypt. They weren't even curious as to why he systematically destroyed Egypt's gods or why he had reduced the mightiest empire at that time into ruins. If they had just asked the question or even been a little bit curious, they would have been delivered from a worldview that consigned them to a life of slavery. The land was a place where God would continue his work to rectify what had been lost in the fall. He would put his name in the land and dwell among a chosen people. He would be their father, and they would be his sons, reflecting his will and ways to the surrounding pagan nations who lived under the reality of a closed door. Hundreds of thousands of people who served many false gods because their worldviews were just as fear-based as Israel's had proven to be. The nations would see a people at peace, secure in its borders, blessed beyond words, where no disease or sickness could be found. They would be prosperous. The nations would learn to put away their false gods and worship the living God. It would be a generational revival where darkness would lose ground and light would shine throughout the earth. They didn't ask what the land meant to God because the question never occurred to them. All that mattered was their survival. The fear of the giants made them suddenly brave enough to return to Egypt. They appointed captains for themselves and made plans to return. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces and tried to intercede for the people. Caleb and Joshua tried to tell the people that they were well able to take the land. The people picked up stones. They would have none of this faith talk any longer. The glory of the Lord suddenly appeared at the door of the tent of meeting. Moses picked himself up off the ground and disappeared into the tent. And when he finally came out, he told the people that the Lord wouldn't allow them to return to Egypt. Instead, they would go into the wilderness where everyone 20 and over would die. The very children they said would become the giants' prey would inherit the land. Now, when the people heard that they had to live in the wilderness, they had a sudden change of heart. They would atone for their sin by taking the land. Except it was too late. They had been disqualified. The Lord was no longer with them. He would wait for a new generation to believe and inherit the land. The people refused to listen. They armed themselves and went up to conquer the land. They were soundly defeated. Israel's failure is directly related to their worldview, which caused them to be disqualified for the good God intended for them to inherit. And at the center of their worldview was a damaged and broken self, and no matter what God did for them, the self never changed how it viewed the world or its place in it. They were still the same downtrodden, defeated, weak people they had been under Egypt's whips. There was only room in their worldview for death. They expected to die, so every setback or test and trial wasn't about his good intentions for them. It was about death finally catching up with them. Wrong thinking will always give you wrong context, and a wrong context will always produce wrong fruit. In the wilderness, the context was survival, and the fruit that context produced was unbelief, hardness of heart, and finally rebellion along the borders of Canaan. And when I look at the children of Israel's failure in the wilderness, I see the importance of changing your thinking. The worldview that defined my life before I was saved can't be the worldview I have now. Christ has come, and my life isn't the same. But I didn't know this. Yes, I knew I was to renew my mind to be conformed to the Son. I knew I was to be transformed. I knew old things had passed away and all things had become new again. I knew the theology of the New Testament, but I still lived in a state of spiritual poverty. I thought I was full in my understanding of Christian doctrine, but I wasn't. I was limited, hindered, and bound up. All I knew was frustration and disappointment. It seemed everything I touched, I ruined. I was spiritually poor, and upon that deficiency, I foundered. That state I just described came from one thing. I didn't understand how my worldview was my true enemy. I didn't know who I was to fight or how I was to fight it. This is the strategy of the thief and robber who came to steal, kill me, and destroy me. He didn't mug me at gunpoint. He was so stealthy and good at his job, I didn't even know I was being robbed. The same thing happened to Israel in the wilderness. The same thing might be happening to some of you. God has done a tremendous thing. He has set you free. He has brought you out of Egypt to bring you into a land flowing with milk and honey. But you are still living in the wilderness, tormented by your thoughts, traumatized by your past, expecting the worst to happen and becoming undone when it does. If all your thinking has brought you to this place, then it's time to have another thought. I heard Graham Cook say that, and he's right. And if you need a place to begin to have another thought, begin with this one. God has not changed his mind about you. You were created for his image and after his likeness. And when he looks upon you, he sees the one he loves. So if you like this podcast, please hit the subscribe and like buttons. Next week, I'll be examining the insecurity of King Saul. In sermons, Saul usually comes off looking pretty bad, mostly because he persecuted David. But I have great sympathy for Saul because I understand how insecurity can be a cancer that poisons and destroys your life. So I hope you'll join me next week as we look at this heroic, and yes, he was heroic, and tragic figure. See you then. Bye.